Hey guys, Trevor here from Me, Myself, and I. Had the unique and pleasant opportunity to speak with Bob the World Builder today. If you don't know who he is, you should check out his channel. He's a hugely successful D&D YouTuber, one of the nicest guys in the biz, hands down. Really fun to talk to, and just a really quality fella. So yeah, I had the good fortune of being able to talk to him today, and now I have the good fortune of being able to deliver that talk to you. So enjoy. So thanks for joining me, man. It's funny because we don't actually really know each other. We just met each other very briefly at Gen Con.
Yes.
But I have to tell you what. Here's how I was introduced to you. So I knew who you were, obviously, but
Okay.
you were walking around Gen Con, and I was like, "Oh, I think that's Bob the World Builder." And Professor DM, Professor Dungeon Master, says to me, "It sure is. You know, he has no idea how famous he is." And I was like, "Oh, really?" So turns out you're huge famous guy. You don't even know it. So
Yeah, I mean,
congratulations.
it's one of those things where I guess I'm like pleasantly surprised by it at conventions and stuff. But always try to remember that yes, in the real world, it's in the grand scheme of things, we're all pretty small out there. So, but it's very cool when I am occasionally like recognized at those places where our type of viewers will gather. So, yeah.
Right. So tell me about you. Tell me about your channel. Like what I want to first hear about is your history with gaming, how you got involved in the game, and your sort of general experience with that.
Okay. Yeah, my experience is probably similar to a lot of people where I had a very good friend. I've been interested in like fantasy media, like books and games, kind of my whole life. But it wasn't until I was wrapping up college age that one of my friends asked if I wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. And my only reference points with D&D up to that point were the few, like snippets or flashbacks from like various sitcoms or cartoon shows where it would literally just be an extremely dramatized version of people all dressed up, all doing voices. Like maybe there's a board and dice shown. Like it really equated to LARPing and like most media that I was familiar with. Um, so I was like, li literally had the impression of like, yeah, I know, like I'm a nerd, we're nerds, but are we that nerdy? Like, can we play D&D? And of course, the rest as the story goes, it's we played, realized it was not that extreme necessarily, and been playing ever since. So it's been close to 10 years now.
10 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're mostly known for D&D 5e. I'm guessing that was your
Yeah.
introduction to the whole experience.
Well, that's interesting too. I also think this is probably pretty familiar for most people, but it was definitely homebrew. Actually, maybe this even more so than other people because like my friend, he had the 5e player's handbook, but none of us knew what we were doing at all. Like nobody else had ever played before. He had only played a little bit prior with like his brother and some friends. And so when we all showed up, I think he had some character sheets already printed out, but told other people like, yeah, just like Google D&D character sheet, print it off, whatever. So we didn't even realize this until we were probably a couple months into playing, didn't realize the differences exactly. But like we had character sheets from different editions of the game that like all in the same party. And so yeah, like we were using the 5e player's handbook sort of, but he was like very much into homebrew and let us all like come up with our own concepts for what our classes and races and things would be like. Um, and it got like really overpowered really fast, but that was just the kind of game that he liked too. So it was all fun, and it's what got me hooked on it. So yeah.
That's kind of the perfect origin story because so many of us started out that way too. Like I remember
Right.
when I started, I was like 8 years old or something, but I was playing in the village of Hamlet, which was an
Okay.
AD&D thing,
Yeah.
and this is shortly after it came out. Shortly after it came out, back before the earth cooled. But I was playing a paladin from the player's handbook. I had no idea what that meant. I didn't. I
Right.
just I just saw knight and I thought, oh, this guy. But the GM was just me and Jason Peters. He was the GM. He was just the two of us. And he said, "Okay, you're in the village of Hamlet. What do you do?" And I went, "What? What?"
Yeah, that's
We
great.
realized
Yeah.
at that point that I had no name. My character had no name. So he said, "Well, what's your character's name?" I said, "Trevor." He said, "No, no, no, no. Your character's name." And I said, "I what?" So he flipped through the Village of Hamlet book and found a name of an NPC, Black J. And
Yeah.
he said, "I think your name should be Black J." I said, "Okay." So I was Black
Okay.
J. Now, of course, I didn't actually meet the character in the Village of Hamlet named Black J. Otherwise, we would have, destroyed each other in a mass explosion of
Right.
energy,
Yeah.
clearly.
The time
But
would have split or something.
exactly. But it was just that situation where, he was using spells from basic D&D, but we were throwing in stuff from and no one ever understood AD&D. I don't know if you ever actually played first edition.
I
No one
haven't
ever
played
used all
it.
the
I have
rules.
the books right over here. I've read chunks of them, but
Well,
sparingly. Yeah.
that alone is a feat. To get through
Yeah,
Gary's
exactly.
Byzantine writing style is
It's when you realize like, oh, I've been reading for like an hour or so, and I'm only how many pages in? Like, it is very dense. It is very dense, not only
oh yeah.
in the literal font size, but also like wrapping your head around some of the concepts as you go along. So, yeah.
It's very instructive as a designer. I just finished a Kickstarter for my own game called The Broken
Right.
Empires, and in the heat of writing the rule book, I find myself sometimes having to stop myself from going to Gygaxian levels of wordiness, because that's what
Yep.
I learned. I learned from his writing style, which was
Mm.
verbose and just overwrought, and
Yeah.
I learned a lot of fancy
Loquacious, as
words from
many
Gary.
people will say. Yeah.
Loquacious.
Yeah. The wordy word for being wordy. Yeah.
Yes. So you started in with a hodgepodge of stuff, and of course, I'm
Right.
sure you look back on that like that was the greatest thing of all time because nobody cared about the
Exactly.
rules. Right.
Exactly, because and like you said, even like your friends was pulling spells from like basic D&D and whatever. Like I was one of the few people I think playing a spellcaster. But he also would just tell me like when I find a new spell, like because it was always like embedded in the quest somehow that I like, oh yeah, you have this new spell now and it does this. And we would like go back and forth like, okay, well yeah, that seemed a little too powerful. We can dial that back, or like maybe instead of based on I don't know, like this modifier, this spell, it would make sense it was based on this stat. And we were just constantly like tweaking everything under the hood the whole time. So it was sort of 5e. It was D20 roll high with the six stats we all know and love. But yeah, that was
Uh,
the beginning. And as I've said before, in like various conversations about this, in the last couple years now, a lot of my thinking about the game has been kind of just trying to recapture that where
right.
it was very loosely put together because it was just kind of more fun that way. At least I found in my experience when after going through a few years where I was like really invested and really having fun with the rules of 5e, eventually realizing like, well, like we could do things a little differently, and then slowly or rather rapidly, I guess, unraveling how invested I was in the rules. So
Right. So did you
yeah.
then find yourself gravitating towards the OSR as time went on because that's a far more less constrictive rule set, or did you go somewhere else? Like what was your journey?
Yeah, yeah. To the first like stepping stones after that game that was like nothing and everything was playing uh third edition. Not even 3.5, I believe, but third edition because my then girlfriend, now wife, found the books. Or I think she borrowed them from a friend who just like happened to find them at a thrift store. It was I don't know where they came from, right? But anyway, we had these books. And these were the books we had because this was before, like a couple months before I even bought my first RPG book. Granted, this is now like 2 years into me being into the hobby. Still didn't even own a book.
Nice.
She like my girlfriend owned these books. And yeah, so we were playing third edition. And at the same time, one of her other friends was running a 5e campaign. So we were kind of like juggling these two rule sets, like in different games we were playing. And occasionally I would like run something that was kind of 5e, but really homebrewed. And I actually even like, this isn't like existing anywhere in the public, but I like wrote my own hack of sort of 5e, like really early on. that we played a couple times. So yeah, it was a weird mishmash all the way through until about like 2017, 2018. So like 3-ish years into playing, 3 years into playing, that I bought the 5e Player's Handbook and really loved that book. Like it was I don't know, it opened up a lot of things to me about the game and like, oh, that's how this was supposed to work this whole time. Sort of epiphanies happening. Um, but ultimately, yeah, I didn't know about the OSR until I guess only in the last couple years, really, probably like 2020-ish when I that started to come on my radar. But I was since that first campaign where everything was very like overpowered, I was always more into like, well, this could be more fun if that we like actually might die, sort of thing.
Hmm.
And so I found myself like coming into those games, kind of through, and I know people like debate whether or not this is actually an OSR game or not, but kind of through Dungeon Crawl Classics because it's
Hmm.
one that I happened to see at a bookstore around the time I bought the PHB, and I flipped through this Dungeon Crawl Classics book and was like, just discovering like, oh, there's other games that that do these same things, and realizing like, okay, but this seems similar enough to D&D. Like I'm just kind of learning that rule set now. I won't get this at this time. And then when I really started digging into other games, that was one of the first I happened upon and realized like, wow, I wish I did start playing this a couple years ago too, because it seems like it kind of captures the level of like comedy essentially that like my friends and I do try to inject into the game. So yeah.
Right, right. That moment of discovery for you, where you realized, oh, there's something else out there that does this experience better. That
Yeah.
is entirely what I'm trying to show viewers on this channel.
Yeah.
Is the
Yeah. Yeah.
fact that there's a universe of games out there, because so many times you hear people who are new to the game, who come into it through 5e because that's a very, very easy entry point, and after a few years they start saying, well, I'd really like to use 5e to do a different genre. Maybe I'd like to do sci-fi. How do I make 5e do sci-fi? And my answer is always, you don't
Yeah.
have to. There's so many other games that are even already so similar in terms of its rule structure to D&D.
True. Yeah.
You take Stars Without Number or something. That's your bog standard D20 system for the most part too. So there's so many game systems out there, and I've sort of made it my crusade to teach people that there's all these different things. So talking about that, do you have any experience with any other types of game systems that rely on different engines, like dice pools or the D100 system or anything like that?
Yeah, the main one for me that's or wait, am I getting this right? Okay, Maze Rats I think is
Oh
2d6.
yeah, yes,
Is it
that's right. That's
2d6 or yeah, okay.
I think so. Yeah.
And games based on that kind of motif, I guess, where it's like, okay, I'm rolling 2d6, generally trying to beat like a 10 or something. And oh, well, and I have played Powered by the Apocalypse. The thing is, I have a terrible memory for this kind of stuff, so I actually keep track of it in a spreadsheet now of all the games I've
Okay.
played. Because last year, I could tell you the number. Last year, 2023, I played 15 different RPGs. Some of
Wow.
those including, because yeah, I just really got on a binge of like, I'm gonna and and in a fortunate position where I have people offering to run one shots of different games for me.
Yeah.
So I do have that privilege of being invited to play a lot of different games. And this year, I think I'm actually at like 17 games just this year now. Some of them
Wow.
probably
Nice.
overlapping, but last year. So off the top of my head, I don't know what a lot of like the names are, but a lot of them are D20 roll high, a handful of D20 roll low, and there's definitely some like dice pool stuff in there. The first one that came to my mind actually was the One Ring, which uses
Ah,
like a D12, but also a pool of D6s for every
D6s.
for every
Yeah.
roll. Yeah, so definitely testing the waters too.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, obviously, as you start to explore these different systems, you're gonna see how they really do create a completely different experience. Like, a
Totally.
lot of people say to me, "Oh, well, mathematically, what's the difference between rolling a D20 and a D100? A D100 is just more granular." Well, exactly. It's
Yeah,
it's
right.
the difference. There's a big difference between a 62 and a 63 if you needed a 62 or less, but you rolled a
Yeah,
63. That
yeah,
1% makes all the difference in that moment. and just the visceral feeling too. I know a lot of people only play online, but for old men like me, we were used to being around a table where you roll real dice, damn it. And
Yep.
so the visceral sensation of rolling 2D, a D100 set percentile dice versus a single D20, that's a very, very different experience than grabbing a bunch of D6s as a pool or a bunch of D10s as a pool, like
Yeah.
World of Darkness or things like that. So each of these game systems, these core engines, have a very, very, very different feel. So I think that's important for people to see too, because it's not just all about the numbers. Like there's so much more that goes into it.
Right. Well, and I think that's because there's other, sides of this coin where when you think about kind of how many systems there are and like ha have experienced a lot of them, as I'm sure you have, and like a lot of people listening might have, sometimes then I'll step back and be like, does the system matter at all? Because like depending on how loose you are with the rule, like it really depends on
Right. Right.
what you're trying to get out of the rules. Because you
Yeah.
can just tell a story, whatever kind of story you want. So it really is like, what do we want the game to take care of for us versus what do we want to just handle ourselves?
That's
And so
a
that's
uh,
why,
that's a
like in a lot of
crucial
my
distinction.
yeah, and in a lot of my explorations, like I said, a lot of it has been kind of just unwinding rules back toward like, okay, what's kind of the bare minimum that I need to rely on from a book? Um, because that's how I started. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a crucial distinction, and that's something that Professor Dungeon Master and I talk about all the time. Because for him, he's very much about how dice are just math rocks that give you a binary answer. Does the person succeed at the task or not? And then you move on, and then you make
Yeah.
everything else up. So I understand the appeal of that very rules light approach because it's quick and
Yeah.
it's evocative. But from my perspective as a more simulationist guy, I like the system to actually
Mhm.
do that heavy lifting for me. So, like I've said a lot about when I'm talking about my own game or sort of any D100 kind of game, especially the more simulations ones like Harnmaster or Mithras or something. It's the difference between saying, okay, I rolled and I hit the orc and I did 5 points of damage, at which point the GM can say, oh, Cray, well, you slash him in the leg and he howls in pain and blood spurts, and he's just
Right.
making that all up. Or
Right.
the dice tell you where you hit, the dice tell you what the quality of wound is, and the dice tell you exactly what that immediate effect of the wound is. So that brings in more rules, but it also brings in more details that the GM doesn't have to come up with because the system does the lifting for you. So it's a preference thing, obviously,
Exactly.
but it's
Yeah.
it's a crucial distinction, right? That's the reason why, like Professor DM, he's ultimately at heart, he's very much a roll d20, roll high, if you get high you win kind of guy,
Yeah.
but he also appreciates the differences between those other games. He was a big fan of Warhammer Fantasy, which is a D100
Right.
game with all
Yeah.
kinds of critical hits and hit locations and things, so it's all just preference. But I think it's important for D&D players out there to understand that the experience you've had at your own table is but one of a universe worth of
Yeah. Yeah.
experiences,
That's
you know?
that, and that's a big one that I'm sure Professor, I'm sure you as a creator, like we deal with a lot, I think, because it's very common to get like commentary on our commentary, disagreeing or or not quite seeing our perspective on things. And so yeah, sometimes it's maybe a reality check for people to realize just that. The way what I'm used to is but one way to play. And every way is right if it's fun for you, is the thing that
Right.
I try to get across in a lot of my videos anyway.
Right, which goes back to your first experience. It didn't matter what the rules were. You guys were just
Yeah.
treating it as a loose structure and making it up as you went along, and it was a great experience. So, speaking of being a creator, tell me about your channel. Tell me about the history of it, how you got started, all of that stuff.
Okay. For me, it was so I've been going a little over 5 years total now, or like 5.5 years actually. And I've been full time for the last two plus of those years. So for a chunk of time, I was doing this while being a outdoor educator, environmental educator. I studied environmental science and then kind of learned like later in the game when I was sort of beginning a path toward like academia and realized like, yeah, I'd rather just like stay outside and oh, honestly, almost in a weird way, like my realizations with RPGs, like wanting just to keep it a little lighter and not get like too granular, maybe
Yeah,
as we
yeah,
brought up. Um, And yeah, so got into like literally I was working at a camp and didn't have quite enough D&D in my life because I moved for this job, but was still playing online with some folks at the time and just realizing like, okay, I have this extra time, like I want to be like making more stuff and maybe if I could like because this is sort of how it started was like wanting to put up some things I was writing on the DMs Guild and then realizing like, well, I want two other things out of this. It's like, well, no one's going to ever see what I publish at this rate. Like it was already only a few years after like the DMs Guild was still only a couple years old, but it was already like becoming saturated. And secondary to that was like, well, I really want to get other people to play this game and just try it because I wish I discovered this 10 years
Hmm.
earlier or more in my life. Um, instead of like in my 20s, I wish I had found it as a child. So it was, yeah, it was partially like wanting to talk about things I was doing and then also just wanting to share this with everybody. So yeah, that's why I started the channel and just did it part time. Like I would be writing scripts like first thing in the morning at work sometime or like on my phone or whatever. And yeah, just like do it, very much a side hustle for a while. Like it was a real grind. And eventually it started competing with that job basically for the amount of time I was able to put into it and what I was getting out of it. And then, to summarize basically, when the big thing happened in 2020 that kind of basically ruined outdoor school field trips
Hmm.
for among many other things. My actual job took a weird turn and really opened the door for me to like invest more time and effort into what I was doing online. So yeah.
Cool. So for like the three people out there who don't know who you are, what would you say like the actual focus of your channel is, or maybe like what were the focus of the channel, but also like what's a really high performing video on your channel that people might know you for? I'm sure there's many, but if you just had to pick one.
The ones that people have probably seen but might not know is I have a single short. I don't do a lot of shorts on YouTube, but yeah, okay, we're on the YouTube platform if I didn't say that, by the way. And I have one short about drinking a potion in 6 seconds that has like 5 million views. It's like vast, like it is ridiculously outcompeting any other thing I've ever made. And I only made it because I had another short that was cut from a whole video I did about potions, where it was like joking about like this previous one was joking about drinking a short and drinking a potion in 6 seconds, and it just randomly started taking off one day. Like you might, if you ever look at your YouTube analytics, sometimes you're like, okay, wait, why are my views like higher than normal right now? Oh, okay, for some reason this short just started getting attention, even though it was like a year old. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna try making another short with like pretty much the same title and but just like a little bit more focused production here. And then it became the most popular thing that I'm probably known for. So yeah, 5 million people have seen me drink a potion in under 6 seconds. But besides that, my most popular content is really one of two different spheres. Uh, Sort of along those lines, the videos of me either trying to walk 24 miles in one day, in 8 hours, I should say, too,
Yeah.
mimicking the rules of D&D, because that was kind of a theme for a period of time on my channel. Or there are a lot of people who know me from some of my earliest videos where I just made very uh, simple breakdown tutorials of the Dungeons and Dragons Essentials Kit Adventure, the Dragon of Icespire Peak, where I basically showed how to like, kind of like so just some tips for preparing each quest because that book just has like 12 tiny, tiny one shots in it basically that you can weave into a campaign of a couple levels.
Hmm.
And I just showed how to like kind of prepare each one and then had separate videos of actual just like audio recordings of my wife and I doing it as like a solo or a one-on-one game. Um, and apparently those were really helpful to a lot of people because I still get comments about them today. And so much so that, yeah, very recently I have kind of decided to like do more of that tutorial stuff because for the last several years, my content and I think a lot of online RPG content has just steered way more into like I don't want to say advanced topics necessarily, but like things that a beginner might not ever care about or even find useful because it's like
Right.
really, really niche stuff. And I really want to try to
Right.
go back toward my initial goal of like helping people get into the game. So
Yeah.
it's probably to mix these things that I'm doing, but yeah. And
Yeah.
so I
Because I
think
mean,
part of your sorry, yeah, just to finish, part of your initial question was like, what's the focus of my channel? Like my little tagline is having more fun playing RPGs. So it's just all trying to gear back to that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's cool. YouTube is obviously it rewards videos that are tutorial based all the time. It's all about I want to learn how to do this thing. Like my channel, I don't have a ton of views, but the ones that get it are always here's how to do this thing because that's
Nice. Yeah.
the five top things. It's classic YouTube, clickbaity stuff, right? But
Yeah.
um, so tell me about the moment that you went from player to game master to dungeon master.
Oh,
Do you remember that
okay.
moment?
Yeah, it was actually it almost happened and then it happened was sort of the story because
Okay.
in that initial campaign where we were all just making stuff up, it was just the one dungeon master, my one friend running that campaign. Um, but we hit a point in the campaign where we uncovered this ancient library and basically, it was kind of in a classic way like, whoa, we opened this book and then we're like teleported into this other like sort of plane or whatever, and like had a little quest like that. And he was like, yeah, now this is a place where like any of you guys could write an adventure and it could like be a book in here, but you would run it as the game master, which was,
Oh.
a very novel idea because
Hmm.
we were all just players, right? And like, you're the game master. What are you talking about? So, but pretty much right away, I like wrote a quest, and then we never went back to that library. So we never I never ran that. But that is kind of what got me thinking like that I wanted to do more of that creation myself, and ultimately really got me on the track of like Bob World Builder, of just like wanting to create my own locations and NPCs and adventures and all that. Um, and yeah, and so then is probably a couple months to a year, a couple months after that, I think, that I did run a one shot in my own little, like, kind of tiny setting with just a couple of those players. And that became like a mini campaign. And then I started running like a homebrew. Goes back to our talk about systems, but a homebrew, like Wild West sort of
Hmm.
setting, which was, yeah, very loosely based on D&D, but I think we pretty much only used like D20 roll high and kept like some of the stats, and then just made up how guns should work.
Right.
It was like, oh, yeah, there was almost nothing to it really. But yeah, so it was probably a year or so into playing that I started running. And I think to this day, I'm the only person from that campaign that was like 6 or 7 players who also ended up running games. Like I was just like the
Really?
most obsessed with it. Like I was helping the game master like schedule our sessions and stuff because like I wanted to play. So yeah, yeah,
So you hear this a lot. I'm not big in the D&D world itself because I haven't played D&D in a very very long time. I play
sure.
literally everything else, but not D&D specifically. So the giant audience out there that is a 5e audience, I don't
Yeah.
have a lot of connection with. But I hear a lot from these people about how DMs are hard to come by, about how everybody wants to play but nobody wants to DM. Has that been your experience in your gaming career as well?
I would say outside of that initial campaign I was in, no. For whatever, I mean, I get part of it is because my one, best friend who was the DM of that campaign, like whenever I GM stuff, he's a player. And when I moved for that outdoor ed job, I was in a different state at the time. Now I'm back near that original friend. But anyway, when I was there, I made some friends and kind of like instilled the idea in a couple of them right away. Like, yeah, and you should run this too. Like, didn't never really made too much of a distinction between like there's game masters and there's players. It was just like, yeah, and then like what would you want to run if you were doing this sort of thing?
Hmm.
Um, and just tried to keep that going. So yeah, in my group currently, like we do play in person almost every week. It's probably more like every other week. It's myself, my wife, my friend who was my original GM, and 3 other friends. And I think out of those, yeah, 6 people, if I just counted that right, like 4 of us game master as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, so we try to keep it like let everybody just run what they want to run basically. Yeah, and but I would say in the wider scheme of things, it does seem like uh D&D kind of has like put DMs on too high of a pedestal, I think. Like it's an important job, of course. Like there is no game without the game master. But I think they've made it seem too intimidating over the last few decades and are only, in these last couple years, maybe as long as 5e's been around, really been trying to break down that idea and show more people like, hey, you can do this too. And that's a lot of what like you and I and other people try to reinforce online, I think, as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
There is, back in the old days, the job of the GM was the most labor intensive because you had to know all the rules
Yeah.
for everything, whereas the players only had to know the rules for that which pertained to their character. So it took a
Yeah.
special kind of person who was really into that and really interested in that thing to want to do the job. And I
Totally.
was always that guy, right? I
And
was always the guy that wanted to run
and
the
I would
game.
say back in the day, I believe, like at least for a period anyway, like there were no modules, like there were no pre-made worlds. So you also not only had to know all the rules of the game, you also had to create the entire setting that you were playing in at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there was an expectation that each GM would run his own world. That was pretty much
Yeah.
baked into the cake right from the beginning. There were the worlds that like Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms that came out in the early 80s and
Yeah.
such that allowed GMs to have a sandbox to sort of fill in. But that's what they were. They were loose outlines of a world, basically. And then as
Yeah.
years went on, they became more and more detailed until they become the bloated mess that the current Forgotten Realms is. I prefer the first edition Greybox Forgotten Realms, where it's essentially blobs of geography and some, scant description of what this culture might be like and go. But
Yeah.
it was assumed that GMs would make their own adventures. And I remember even in those old modules, very few of them, maybe up until the Dragonlance era, very few of them specifically said, this is a module that takes place in Greyhawk. I mean, they did exist, but most of the time they were just
Right.
designed, they can be played in any world that is friendly to the D&D genre, that you just kind of
Yeah.
drop them in. But the idea that GMs had to do all the work, that was that was always there, but it was never quite as intimidating. But I think what has perhaps added to the intimidation factor is with the explosion of Mercer's gang there, and I know those guys. I know those guys from Hollywood. I used to
True.
work with them all the time. Um, with the explosion of that, especially around the time of the pandemic, you've heard about the Mercer effect, right? Where people
Yeah.
saw him as kind of like the
Comparing.
vanguard of what a GM
Yeah.
is supposed to be and comparing themselves to that. And their games are not like anybody else's games because they're
No.
professional actors and they have a very, very specific focus on storytelling and playing in character and all of that stuff. But that's not everybody's game and that's not everybody's preferred game. But I do think, because I've seen this argument, I've heard people talk about it, that they are
Mm.
intimidated to run a game because they've seen that Mercer set the bar so high that people feel it's that they well, if I can't do it like him, I can't do it, which of course is ridiculous. But a lot of
Yeah.
people get it. So do you run into that yourself, and do you have any advice for people who might be falling victim to that mentality?
Oh, I mean, there's little else to add besides like the classic comparison is the thief of joy. Like it really,
Yes.
and I think of what a lot of people, another way a lot of people break down the Matt Mercer effect. I'm pretty sure something that Matt himself has countered to this because I know he's like been fighting against this tide now for
Right.
several years himself.
Right.
Because he wants more people to not be intimidated by his, skills and
Yeah.
what he's good at and whatever. Is like so much of that game, as you suggested, also weighs on those players, also all being professionals. So it's not
Yes.
just like the GM carries all of that. It's like he's with this team of people who know exactly what they're doing. And so if you don't know what you're doing, your players don't know what you're doing. It's like it's kind of that ignorance is bliss. Like you're gonna have a great time probably if you just lean into whatever you find fun. And that's what I always circle back to is like whatever you're finding fun. If it's working, there you go. Like you're Matt Mercer now. Good job.
Right.
So
It,
he just knows what's
including
fun for his group, and it happens to be widely appealable, to a lot of
yeah.
other people. But
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And if your group finds it fun to swap character sheets from different editions as you play, then that's great. That works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I got slammed with the Mercer effect myself for the solo thing. I don't know if you know much about the channel, but I started doing a bunch of solo gameplay, which was a joke. Wouldn't it be hilarious if I played all the characters myself? And then it turns out there was all these people that solo played. I was like, huh? What? But
I didn't know
so,
you played a whole party. I assumed it was like like maybe two
oh yeah,
characters.
yeah.
Or,
Well,
okay.
it depends on the situation, but I certainly play
Okay.
the entire world because I'm the GM and the player
Right.
too.
Yeah.
But uh,
Okay.
so briefly, the story of how that all came about was
Yeah.
with the success of Critical Role, there was a bunch of us in the world in LA at the time in the gaming world that were approached by a very large company who shall remain nameless that was looking to
Really?
do their own version of Critical Role. So they approached me and a couple of other guys, a couple of the voice actors in LA, and we had this whole thing set up where I was going to run it, and I had this whole world set. It was all great. It was all going to be awesome. But trying to herd professional voice actors like us is like herding cats. Couldn't make the schedules work. Like we were supposed to fly over to England for a few months and shoot a bunch of stuff like in block shoots, and it was all going to be great. And then it didn't happen. So I was so disappointed because I'd done all this work. I was like, well, you know what? To hell with them. I'm just going to do it myself. I'm going to play every character. I'm going to somehow do this myself. So I started the channel. It turns out that I was not the first one to do that. There was a lot of people actually doing solo. But the point of this is to say that because I'm a professional. I've worked in showbiz my whole life.
Yeah.
I wasn't doing some YouTube channel. I was doing a show. I was doing a 7-camera setup with, lights and miniatures and sound effects and music. I'm doing a show, man. So because that became very popular right around the time of the pandemic, when there was a lot of people sitting at home looking for something to watch,
Right. Okay.
I sort of suffered from the Mercer effect in the solo world, where people now went, oh, this is the meme. We can't possibly play solo because you have to do it like Trevor does on
Oh
Me,
my
Myself, and
gosh.
Die.
Wow. Even
And I was like,
solo people were. Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah. So
Because
it's
you
it's a
think at least in
common,
that setting, for me, I can say a lot of like if I'm worried about, how I'm gonna basically perform at something, it's because other people are watching. It's because I would be running that game for other people and other people might see it or whatever. But if I was just running a game for myself, yeah, I would have no qualms about what it would end up looking like, I guess. So that is funny to me how almost a
yeah,
little sad, but yeah, how so many people might have been
yeah,
worried about how even their solo performance might not live up to the great Trevor Duvall. Not to
right.
diminish your talents at all. I know you're great at what you do. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
was, people will find anxiety in anything they can.
yeah, I guess that's the moral of that story.
Well, that's cool, man. I just wanted to sort of get to know you a little bit and get some of your origin story, your super villain origin story a little bit. Because yeah, like I said, we didn't really get a chance to gab too much at Gen Con, but you're one of the greats in the RPG world out there. So I wanted to have you on and say that I had you on the show. So so
All
thanks for
right.
joining me here. Are you going to be
Yeah,
at
my
any
pleasure.
conventions coming up or anything like that in the next little while?
Yeah, depending on when this is airing, I will be
It'll be
at.
soon. It'll be soon.
Okay, so I will be at PAX Unplugged in December in Philadelphia. It
Okay.
is the first weekend of December, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm sure I'll run into you at one of these other conventions because I got to start hawking my own game at these things now. So
Yeah, you're in the circuit now. Yeah.
I'm in the circuit. I'm on the in the club on the team.
All right.
Thanks, man. Super fun, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.